Hey everyone, it's been a while since I was on here. Today I'm going to take a look at education in Canada. Not just Canada, but specifically Ontario, Canada. And the reasons why it's Ontario and not all of Canada are going to become more clear later. So first, I want to give a special thanks and shout out to Xavier Fazio, Emily Curtin, and Meredith Park Rogers for their help and collaboration in putting this together. So let's take a quick look at the history of Canada. Very brief history, that is. Canada has been around for a really long time, pretty much as long as the Earth. It's been populated with an indigenous population back till, I don't know, a long time ago. But European exploration doesn't really begin until around 1500, when you have both French and British explorers slash troops slash colonists all around Canada. Now, all the way from your first permanent settlements from about 1600 until around 1900, you have these on-again, off-again wars between the European settlers and the First Nations inhabitants. Now, there are some interesting developments around freedom of religion and freedom generally that happened in Canada before happen in the United States, even though the United States often is credited for being the first to do a lot of these things. It's not really the case. For example, what those of us in the United States call the French and Indian War was a war between the British and the French for control over Canada. Basically, you had the British and their First Nations allies against the French and their First Nation allies, because they both occupied what we now call Canada, and they were fighting over who controlled the territory. Ultimately, the British and their allies took control. Now, there were themes of independence on both sides, and so that kind of predates some of the independence themes that we see in the United States later. Now, there's also the Quebec Act, which came after the French and Indian War. The Quebec Act gave religious freedom to Catholics, i.e. the French, despite now being the ones not in control of the territory. And that Quebec Act became part of the foundational ideas behind the Canadian Constitution that would come later. Now, of course, you have the American Revolution, which resulted in one, American independence, but two, British loyalists that immigrated to Canada. Later, you have the War of 1812, where Canada repels an American invasion. Now, in 1867, Canada becomes its own nation when the British Parliament passes the British North America Act, essentially giving Canada independence. This was known as Dominion Day for a long time. It's now known as Canada Day. Now, during the second half of the 19th century, Canada goes through extensive expansion and annexation in the West, much like the United States. Also, like the United States, they make some serious mistakes with the indigenous population. More about that in a bit. Now, in the 20th century, Canada becomes heavily involved in both World War I and World War II. They also experience a very high degree of immigration into Canada. The other crazy thing that happens in the 20th century is the last residential school closes. The residential school were for the First Nation children trying to assimilate them into Western culture. That didn't close until 1996. Now let's take a look at some educational context in Canada. Now, Canada is difficult to talk about in terms of education because there is no national Office of Education. Ontario has its own educational system, Alberta has its own educational system, and so forth. Now, this can be problematic because how do you compare the education of one completely different system to another? Now, there is a group called the Council of Ministers of Education Canada. Their job is basically just to get together and act as a forum. They talk about the issues surrounding education in Canada. They're the reason you have similarities among provinces due to this common framework for outcomes in K-12 education that they developed. Now let's take a quick look at educational context within the First Nations. Basically, all textbooks refer to this Canada-First Nations relationship as complicated. Nobody wants to say, we screwed up really bad. Now, Canada operated an extensive residential school system. The point of these residential schools was to, quote, kill the Indian in the child. Yeah, that aged like milk. The last one didn't actually close until 1996. They were around for a really long time. They caused a huge loss of identity for individuals and for entire groups of people. Right now, Northern Ontario has over 104 First Nations communities, some of them very remote, some of them without things like clean water. Recently, Canada did launch what they call the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The point of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is partly to inject a more accurate picture of the truth into Canadian education education and history education, and also to try to reconcile some of the terrible wrongdoings done towards the First Nations people. Now let's take a look at the national and provincial exams. Canada does have the Pan-Canadian Assessment. It happens every 3 years. There's a random sampling among students. It's not really tied to individual achievement. It's just kind of there to say, here's how we're doing. Canada also scores very highly on the PISA test. PISA is an international assessment meant to try to compare one nation to another. Canada scores plus 23 points in math, plus 29 in science, and plus 33 in reading. Not bad, right? Now, PISA tests basically have no classroom impact, though. It's only really used for policy. Sometimes the media plays it up as worse than it really is, but that's part of what media does. Now, in terms of provincial exams, Ontario administers a test in reading, writing, and math. There's also a literacy exam required for graduation. Now let's take a look at some other educational context. The school year in Canada is really similar to the United States. There's between 172 and 190 days, depending which province you're from. In Ontario, it's 190 days. The school day usually runs from 8 to 3 or maybe 9 to 4. The path to becoming a teacher is pretty simple. Usually you complete your bachelor's degree and then go on to another school to complete a teacher certification. Once you have that certification, there's no more professional development required for teachers. That means that a teacher could hypothetically pass their certification in the 70s and still be teaching today, having done no professional development since then. In terms of innovation in schools, Canada has an office called Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada. So that means that they have explicitly tied this idea with economic development and innovation. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau also draws a pretty explicit connection between national security and innovation.
A new Liberal government will invest to kickstart Canada's innovation potential. To do it, we'll invest $200 million each year over the next 3 years in a new innovation agenda. We need to be as good as our competitors in the US and Germany at creating partnerships between business, government, and post-secondary research.
Now, in terms of beliefs about STEM in Canada, they're similar to the United States in that they're mixed. Trudeau thinks of himself as a STEM advocate, but not only STEM advocate, but also STEM advocate for underserved populations. Now, in Ontario, Premier Doug Ford also claims to be a STEM advocate, although you should know that Ford can be a controversial figure with controversial stances, especially in the education sector. Now let's talk about what people believe in terms of making in education. So, in Canada, making is generally viewed as something that happens on a school-by-school level. It's probably after school, some kind of extracurricular thing. Now, maker education is subject to some of the same inequities that plague all education in Canada. For example, a school might be very rural and not have access to a lot of the resources that a more urban school has. Or maybe there's just a socioeconomic divide in the school and they just don't have the access to the computers at home to practice some of the making skills that they could do at school otherwise. Some organizations, such as Science North, seeks to resolve some of those inequities in Northern Ontario by traveling with a mobile makerspace to those locations. Even in some instances, they have to fly in to some of these First Nations schools, which is great, but it presents some problems when you try to do it on a large scale. In a regular high school, students might take a class that has making principles in it, even if the class isn't about making. For example, construction technology is a technology class that's going to include making. However, healthcare is a technology class that's a lot less likely to have making in it. Computer science and engineering are rising ideas in the United States. They're becoming a lot more popular all across the world, and Canada's no different. However, the computer science standards in Ontario are a little old, but never fear, they're being updated right now. There have also been recent additions to computer science and coding in the elementary math curriculum. Engineering is embedded in the curriculum for grades 1 through 8. After that, a student might choose to take some courses that include engineering, but it's not required. Play in education is something that's embedded in kindergarten curriculum, but not something that's really a high priority after that. It could happen, but we don't really so much try to make it happen. There is something called discovery learning in math, which basically means that students try to discover a math principle and kind of frame it through their own lens. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, remember the controversial one? He's the one that says he wants to scrap discovery learning in favor of more arithmetic and memorization.
Kids used to learn math by doing things like memorizing a multiplication table And it worked. Instead, our kids are left with experimental discovery math. That hardly teaches math at all.
Now, how does the Ontario education system view creativity? Well, it's not really referenced in the standards. It's basically up to the discretion of the school and teacher how creativity is going to be embedded in the curriculum. There are some organizations, such as People for Education, that have argued that infusing and assessing creativity in Canadian schools is vital. Okay, so with these things in mind, it begs the question, so what? So here's some recommendations. First, teachers really aren't required to do any kind of professional development after their certification. We know that meaningful professional development leads to an average 21% improvement on student scores. 21%? We're in a line of work where we scrap and claw for 1%. So Ontario needs to phase in PD requirements for teachers. Include opportunities in areas like STEM education, computer science, engineering, play, creativity. Make them available and do the outreach to make sure that teachers know these opportunities exist so that they do meaningful PD instead of the fluff that might be available. Recommendations in terms of STEM. Continue to encourage participation in STEM coursework and extracurricular activities. Do the outreach to get people doing these things. Place a little more emphasis on providing resources to underserved populations in STEM activities. This could be interpreted as being in compliance with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So you've got to do it anyway. Might as well do some of it in STEM. Recommendations for computer science and engineering. 1. Hype up the new computer science standards. They're on their way. People know they're on their way, but do they have a good impression of them? Do the outreach to make sure that people have a good impression about these coming standards. 2. Plan now for how you are going to get the computers and other support equipment to some of these rural and underserved schools. How are you going to get them there? How are you going to maintain them? How are you going to support them? Make the plans now. Also, work with those communities to establish a plan for how to integrate those technologies in a culturally sensitive and meaningful way. Now finally, recommendations relating to creativity. I'm convinced that Canadian children are just as creative as anybody else in the world. We do a lot of creative things everywhere. But we need to encourage the embedding of these creative processes in the curriculum in the classroom. And I think it's worth our time because the creative process uses scientific practices and engineering practices, and it increases self-efficacy, things that we want in our science and engineering classrooms. Likewise, we should look for the students that are being creative, that are doing the creative things in schools. Try to hype them up. Do the outreach to make sure that other people know they exist and that they know what they're doing. Open the horizon and open the eyes of Ontario children and teachers as a whole to see what they could be doing. We should do some of this on the social media that the children are actually using. What do the teachers use for social media? Do it there. What if you have a social media account that highlights the creativity of Canadian children? Give control of this account to one student every week who is doing something creative so that they can highlight the things that they're doing. Of course, monitor it, but use that to hype up the creative things that Canadian children actually do. Try to open the eyes of other children and other teachers to what happens if you embed creativity in the schools. Well, thanks for joining me. If you have any questions or ideas on how we might improve creativity, STEM, and maker education in Ontario, feel free to leave them in the comments. Thanks.